It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this session on regulations for the net zero power system organized by India Smart Grid Forum. India has set an ambitious target of net zero by 2070, and the power sector should achieve net zero before 2020. This is a platform to discuss the latest insights and adoption of new technologies and business model to achieve this target. Our esteemed panel of speakers will share their expertise on a wide range of topics that come under regulations for the net zero power system. Now, I would like to invite Mr. P.K. Pujari, former chairperson, CERC, and former secretary, Ministry of Power, for chairing the session. I welcome you, sir. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Rahul Tongia, Senior Fellow, CACP, who will also be moderating this session. I welcome you, sir. There would be a theme presentation by Mr. Enrique, who is Project Lead Regulatory Energy Transition Accelerator, International Energy Agency, will join us for a theme presentation on accelerating decarbonization through regulatory innovation, emerging model for clean energy procurement in the context of inclusive energy transition. Please join us, sir. We have a panel of speakers consisting of Mr. R.P. Singh, Chairperson, UPERC. Please join us, sir. Mr. Christopher, President, Plugged In Strategies, USA. Mr. John Shaw, Director, Florence School of Regulations. Now, I will hand over to Mr. Rahul Tongia to moderate this session. Thank you. Mr. R.N. Sen, sir, former Chairperson, WBERC. Now, I will hand over to Mr. Rahul Tongia to moderate this session. Thank you, and I hope you will have a fruitful session ahead, sir.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure, and we're going to actually debate something. So we're talking about regulation and net zero, which in and of themselves are topics worthy of many PhDs. And then when you try and put them together, let's see how far we can progress. So before I request our chair to give opening remarks, we have a theme presentation from IEA, for which I would request Enrique Gutierrez to share some remarks to get the juices flowing. Thank you. It should be up, or they'll have it up.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so while we get started with the slides, I'll just introduce myself, and thank you very much for the attention, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here representing the IEA. My name is Enrique Gutierrez, and I work in the unit for renewable integration and secure electricity. I'm going to kind of present this kind of, as you say, to get the juices flowing, focusing on one particular aspect where we see regulation and innovation in business is kind of driving investment in renewables. And this is a project that we've been doing collaboration with Google, focusing on corporate procurement, but particularly zooming in on what are the options that can be deployed by emerging economies, particularly in the context where renewables are already cost competitive, and it's more an issue of opening the market and ensuring that we can leverage private capital to actually achieve the objectives that are set in policy and energy strategies in the long term. So where's the... Okay. So why is this topic relevant, for example? So as you may know, the IEA, we're an international organization. Basically, we're advising governments. We have it's an intergovernmental organization with member economies where India is one of the strategic partners as well. So usually we're known for monitoring NDCs, for putting out a world energy outlook, and for kind of providing a long-term perspective of where the system is going. But in this case, we're looking more at what is, at the same time that you have a trend towards increasing long-term commitments to another Paris Agreement, you also have an increasing trend of companies setting net zero targets and RE100 pledges in a way both to procure cheaper electricity where it's available, and also due to changing pressure in terms of marketing and satisfying consumer needs for more responsible businesses. So what we see in the analysis, and this is kind of data that we took from Bloomberg and also own analysis, is that there's there's more than 1,000 companies around the world that have like set different targets for net zero. These are both, on the left-hand side, you have the net zero targets, and you can see how many of them have set the specific target dates. I think the most popular is 2050, and after 2050 you have some other objectives that need to be attained. I think the difference when you look at RE100 is looking more at electricity-specific targets, and here you can see that the attainment date for these objectives is beyond 2050, which is also in line with the kind of IEA net zero roadmap, where we see the power sector being the easiest and the fastest sector to decarbonize that we can then use to leverage other types of decarbonization across different sectors as we electrify, for example, industry, transport, and heating. Now, when looking at different models for clean energy procurement across the world, I think the first question to look at is, what is the power sector structure? And we found in the research that there's very different types of models that can be deployed according to the specific power sector structure. A lot of the literature out there right now focuses on very liberalized markets that have kind of the whole privatization and restructuring going from the generation to the retail end. But particularly when we look at emerging economies with fast-growing populations and fast-growing demand, we're really focusing more on, for example, we have the target countries, like we're looking, for example, at India and Indonesia, Brazil, and like Mexico, for example, and these are countries where you still have maybe restructuring. In the case of Indonesia, you still have a single buyer model, for example. So it's more difficult to kind of find, it's more tailored in terms of identifying the models that we need to look at, what is the particular procurement option that is available. And here we see that even though these pledges are usually voluntary from the side of the businesses, it is up for policymakers and regulators to enable the greatest amount of options in terms of what business models can be developed. So in this report, when we look at clean energy procurement, we consider all the way from corporate PPAs to on-site generation or self-consumption, green tariffs, green tariffs, and tailored options by utilities, which is the one where we see that's probably one of the most promising as well in India as well. For the report, as I mentioned, we focus on India and Indonesia, which is where we have the detailed models of the power system. And we looked at, for example, because we're working in collaboration with Google, who are targeting 24/7 CFE, was kind of identifying what are the benefits, for example, when you go from annual matching, which is basically all of your annual consumption being matched by an equal amount of a clean energy supply, as opposed to hourly matching. I think the first thing we need to say is that we already see annual matching as having value to driving decarbonization, as it kind of encourages and gives us a signal to the policymaker that there is appetite and there's viability for investing in renewables. But what we also see is that there should be greater ambition, because as the share of renewables increases in the power system as a whole, the relative emissions reduction for each individual company reduces, because you're starting off from a cleaner grid. So what we see is, for example, that while annual matching strategies have a value at the beginning for and allowing the companies to themselves declare that they are reducing their emissions close to 100%, as the power system has a higher share of renewables, the actual reduction in emission from the baseline they started is actually lower. So that's what we're kind of pushing and kind of like trying to make policymakers aware that more ambitious decarbonization targets actually lead to greater investment, and also lead companies to have more robust claims in terms of the emissions reduction from the electricity they procure. Another thing that we found in the report, and particularly kind of conducive to this, the question of net zero, is how different implementation of clean energy procurement strategies actually affects the development of the power system. So here you can see we took two models for the Indian power system, which is based on the sustainable development scenario of the IEA, and for Indonesia, which is based on the announced pledges scenario of the IEA. And what we see is that when you go from annual kind of energy banking or corporate procurement, like annual matching, in the model, it just leads to increased installation of solar PV that covers all of the matching demand on an annual basis. This pattern also because of the overbuilding, so to speak, of solar PV, allows for covering this demand also through, if it's in a monthly scenario. But actually, when we move to the hourly procurement, you see that rather only having investment in solar PV, you have a more diverse investment, which, for example, you can see here that in both scenarios, well, particularly in India, hourly matching actually leads to more investment in wind, in battery storage, and in clean dispatchable. In this case, we took bioenergy. So in a way, having more ambitious targets and more ambitious procurement strategies and building that awareness actually conduces to greater investment in a more diversified portfolio of dispatchable technologies, which is also what we want to make sure that there's availability around the clock. Another thing that we noticed, for example, there's this kind of, when you focus on your goal, there's a question of whether you want to procure 100% through renewable energy or you want to set your target around emissions reduction. There's some metrics out there. In this case, there's a clean CFE, the carbon-free energy. It's an indicator, basically, kind of scoring the average emissions intensity of your consumption. And we see, for example, that with going from a CFE of 90, which is basically saying that your energy is 90% carbon-free, as opposed to being 100% carbon-free, it leads to a much more significant increase in the cost, whereas it's just a 10% reduction in the kind of the last bit of the emissions. So I think that's one of the things to consider when, from the policymaker's perspective and the regulator evaluating which is the reporting you do in terms of clean energy, that sometimes you might not want to kind of take the last step and then just kind of ensure that you get the greatest decarbonization for the kind of the most cost-efficient pathway. Another thing that we found as well in the report is that having more ambitious corporate procurement target and integration with the power system actually leads to an overall system cost advantage relative to annual or monthly or less ambitious targets. So here on the left-hand side, you see that basically you have the peak cost, the fuel cost, and the operating cost, which is our baseline, as if you didn't have any corporate procurement. And we see that basically if you go for 100% hourly matched coverage of your energy demand, you actually kind of net out and you end up at kind of net zero in terms of cost differential for the system. This, of course, accounting for the emissions reduction that you have previously. But then actually there's another layer of, say, benefits where if you dispatch these assets and you optimize them across with a systems perspective, you actually have a slight differential of, in this case, it was a net value to the system of, I think, $10 per megawatt hour that is actually being kind of results in system cost benefits when you actually operate additionally procure energy using the system flexibility resources, using the grid, and dispatching this energy across the power system. But yeah, I mean, the thing, as everyone here knows, there's a big difference between the engineering, modeling, optimization, and what we actually see in the system. So as part of the kind of the qualitative analysis and the review of the different countries that we did, we saw that there are some key barriers that still need to be addressed by policymakers. In many of the countries, for example, licensing and grid access have been one of the biggest barriers to ensure that the financing actually takes place. So for example, even though there might be the appetite by corporates to sign a long-term PPA or for developers to actually develop this resource, if there's uncertainty as to what are the grid access connections, how is the methodology for determining this cost changes, it will really affect the final investment decision. Another point that is particularly relevant is the interaction with existing tariff structures. So here we have, for example, the decision, for example, if you're a corporate, in many cases, there is the existing tariff structure might actually encourage you implicitly to do, for example, behind-the-meter procurement and exiting the network costs in a way that actually benefits individual corporate buyers, but it actually, it's a bit of the problem of grid defection, where the rest of the network costs end up passing to the captive consumers that do not have a greater agency in terms of what option they choose. One point that we've seen also across, I think, most geographies is the ability to report and monitor. So this is kind of double counting. I think here is really related to what are the energy attributes that you can actually report yourself if you're buying from the local utility or if you're procuring directly. This is still very kind of fragmented in terms of what is the data reporting requirements and how does this, particularly when you go into international trading. Another point that we've seen is the compatibility with broader energy policy. So for example, when you have grid defection, you can't cover the cost of other, for example, cross subsidies you might have for energy access, or when, and particularly important it is to ensure for policymakers that when corporate procurement is deployed, that it actually contributes to supporting the effect of existing market mechanisms and policy support mechanisms for investment in renewables. Lastly, and I think this is one of the most important ones, particularly thinking in smart grids, is the clarity of data requirements at different levels. One of the things we've seen in markets where there's a lot of corporate procurement is that basically every company has to first decide how much energy they consume, And this a bit of a lack of a common approach. So basically, you end up with different companies deploying their own mechanism. And how this gets reported into a regulator or to the system operator is very mixed and matched. So I think particularly here is where regulators and policymakers have an opportunity to build, a kind of clear kind of data ecosystem. In terms of our recommendations, I think I already touched on one of them. It's important of setting goals, even in the case of voluntary goals, because they help build momentum for policymakers and show that there's appetite for investment, and that the more ambitious goals are actually more conducive to a more healthy development of the power system. I think that here the key action is ensuring that the policymakers to enable the greatest amount of options for corporate procurement. I think particularly India is one of the countries where we see that there's all the different options available, from green tariffs to corporate PPAs to, so there's clean certificates and so on, whereas in some countries that option is still not available, and it's important to consider that not all consumers will be able to, for example, contract and PPA directly, or take on the risk of actually procuring their own clean electricity. One point as well in terms of how we measure the emissions. As we decarbonize the power system, it's important to pay more attention to what are the emissions that are being displaced, because in a way it's not so much about investing in renewables for renewables' sake, but it's investing in decarbonizing the power system and ensuring that there's electricity supply at the lowest emissions possible. So that actually enables that companies that are employing these strategies actually get more bang for the buck, so to speak. And lastly, we need a systems perspective. And yeah, with that, I just want to say, the IA is ready to support through the platforms and different work that we're doing. So please let me know if you have any questions following this presentation, but I'll leave you to that, and then thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. I have a bunch of reactions, but we'll wait for the discussion. One is, of course, the focus on corporates and companies, because they're change and they're the buyers. But at the same time, public policy has other trade-offs. Second observation is, even at the beginning, you started with net zero. So how we come to this word net and this offset, the issues of hourly versus annual, or what in a side discussion with R.P. Singhji just a few minutes back, he talked about energy versus capacity. And this confusion, maybe he'll share some thoughts. But the biggest thing, and for those who have not seen the IEA reports, they're very detailed on different scenarios. These are not predictions, they're scenarios. And the scale needed is just unprecedented. The thing I take away from many of these models, you see that it said, well, we need this much storage or this much more clean energy to reach these. These are unheard of, unimaginable levels of scale for India, but also for many other countries. And so that's another point for regulators and the regulatory framework, because we're now no longer talking about tinkering at the margins or the edges. It's complete overhauls that are up for discussion. So thank you for the settings. It's now my pleasure to request Shri Pujari, former Power Secretary, but also then Chairman CERC, and a domain expert, but also an administrative expert, to share opening chair remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to participate in these deliberations. And today we have in the panel experts who are very, very well versed in their domains. So, and the theme presentation that was made, I think, has covered the issues and also raised a lot of points. So I'll be extremely brief and make some passing points. And I would like the panelists to respond to those issues and also give their insights. So thank you. So I'll just briefly mention what I think are the key factors that needs to be kept in mind or addressed when we talk about net zero. As we all know, India has set the target of net zero by 2070. And power sector and the transport sector being the two largest sectors which have emissions. So power sector has to achieve the net zero by 2050 if you are talking about the country achieving the net zero by 2070. And you all know the power sector is dominant as in today by fossil fuel. and there is a need to move towards cleaner energy. And the achievement in the last few years have been outstanding, and we are mostly on the right track, because the policy and the regulatory frameworks that have been put are not only incentivizing, but also facilitating the larger generation of renewable. The challenges that we face while we integrate the renewable into the grid, that also has been well recognized, and the corrective regulatory frameworks and the policy frameworks have been put. And we, at the moment, seem to be on track. But as was mentioned by Mr. Tongia, Rahul, the target is so huge, and the requirement, as he mentioned, is so huge and large that this gradual approach probably will not work, but we need to have to look at taking some drastic steps. In that sense, some of the areas that we need to look at, apart from what we are doing today, is looking at the option of carbon trading, option of exploring the possibility of green hydrogen. This needs to be pushed. Then encouraging EVs. A lot of work has been done, but then I think we need to push it strongly. Storage needs to be addressed. There are peer-to-peer trading, because a lot of consumers will become prosumers, so we need to have develop the peer-to-peer trading. And in that context, the role of blockchain that needs to be done. But after all, again, in the context of how do you going to price, so the standard pricing or tariff mechanism that we have been following probably will not be sufficient. That need be altered those tariffs. We may have to really look at seriously the time of date tariff, because we need to look at those issues, and that requires a lot of changes in the regulatory framework and also the mindset of the consumers and the policy makers. Banking, again, is issue that I think most of the experts will flag how do you going to address that issue. But as I mentioned, these are the issues, or these are the points that we need to look at if we really have to push towards 2070 net zero. The challenges that we have in the integration, the traditional way of integrating those higher renewable into the grid we have done, but one of the parallel exercise that is being done is to expand the balancing area. We are talking about integrating the South Asian countries market, so that it becomes much easier for a country like India to basically balance the grid. That work is very, very vigorously being pursued by the regulators of the neighboring countries. There is a forum there which is working on that. So that again is a positive sign which will help us to address the issue of balancing. One point that I need to like to put before the House is every transition, we are in, as you all agree, we are in an energy transition taking place, we are in the process of transition. Every transition has cost. And in the Indian context, many of these costs are not explicitly brought out. Sometimes they're even hidden. And ultimately, it gets parked at the lowest level, at the DISCOMs level. It doesn't get passed on to the consumers. And either, even if the best or most efficient system that you have the most efficient system put in place, still the cost will be there. And to what extent this cost gets passed on to the consumer, both what are the political economy of that and who bears that, this is an issue which needs to be debated, I think, very, very openly. And if it is recognized that these transitions do have cost, then it is the political economy or the setup or the government of the day needs to convince people, saying that for good reasons this cost has to be passed on to the consumer, and then everybody has to bear it. So this frank debate, I think we are shying away for whatever reasons. And there's a time now, because till we did marginally, it was okay. I mean, in the sense that from 2013-14, now we came to 2023, we have some cost. But then I think as we go towards the net zero, this cost will be huge. And we can't keep not talking about it or not passing on ultimately to the consumer, somebody or the society as a whole to bear it. So how going to apportion that cost is a major issue. Again, there's a political issue, who bears what much. That's a separate topic altogether. But recognizing those costs and then acknowledging that's a big issue. This has to be done. So these are the few thoughts that I leave it, and I expect the panelists to give their views. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pujarini. I took away a few points. One was you started with the phrase incentivizing. And so the question always comes back, what is the objective function of regulations beyond, and how do you handle trade-offs? You mentioned there's a cost. And so the issue of not just how much is there, acknowledgement is the first step, you said, then quantification, but then apportionment or distribution of these costs is yet another layer at which we need to think of regulations and policies. So there's much to discuss, and thank you for setting the stage in some of the questions. We'll mix up the order a little bit. The general flow hopefully will be a few minutes of opening remarks by everyone, then one round digging a little deeper into going beyond just buzzwords or statements that no one would disagree with, but then we get into the details, what really happens digging. And then another round we hope to have more, what else do we need to do? What else could the government do? How do we think of new ideas or get things accelerated? So with that in mind, I'd like to request Shri R.P. Singh, who's UPERC chairman, but also has a long history of both administration and finance, to share remarks. Would you like to be? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Regulatory support is quite a challenging task, and when it comes to providing for adoption of new technologies for net zero, it becomes furthermore complex. We have to address to each and every dimension of the ecosystem, be it demand, and how the supply is to be met, and how the consumers are to be, interface with it, and what is going to be the techno-commercial and dispute resolution framework. India has already embarked upon its net zero pathway through decarbonization of the grid, through decentralization and digitalization. Now, the burden on the grid is increasing rapidly because now the policy initiatives for e-mobility have been introduced. For industrial decarbonization, issues like green hydrogen, etc., have been also incorporated. On the capacity addition side, we have done tremendous work. We have, in fact, achieved about 40% through the renewables, and if you take hydro also into account, it almost 50% of the capacity we have out of 400 gigawatt is from the renewables. And the generation is also roughly 20%. So now the renewables have reached a proportion which is no longer insignificant. And these are now having started making its impact on the grid. Earlier we used to have, in good old days, not very good old days, but till few years ago, we used to have a conventional system of peak load and base load system. But now we have to manage the flexible generation and the flexible load, both. So this makes the whole process very, very complex. We have to introduce certain measures through policy, through technologies, to make the grid stable, resilient, and reliable and balanced. New actors have emerged. New actors like solution integrator, aggregators, prosumer, energy communities, virtual power plant, virtual transmission system. All these have emerged. They all have some role to play in this modern so-called green grid. So what and how and who will define their role is very, very critical. The grid balancing is a technical subject. I'm not going to go into that. But there are certain challenges which have emerged because of the renewal that needs to be addressed. Like, for example, forecasting and scheduling and the deviation accounting of the renewables, because they cannot be ignored. They have been given must-run status, but they have the propensity to jeopardize or basically collapse the grid. So they need to maintain discipline through their normal behavior like forecasting and scheduling, etc. So that has to be done. In fact, fortunately, we have already in the recent years introduced, most of the states as well as the CERC has done it. Then the increasing use of economic dispatch is one thing we cannot overlook. We do not have still a strategy for renewable curtailment. That needs to be developed. Under what circumstances the renewable curtailment can take place. And the biggest challenge which we are having is of ancillary market development. Though CERC has come out with some sort of regulation, but the ancillary market challenges are, the states are still grappling with that, how to address, and that is to be operationalized. Now, we are talking a lot about EVs, battery storage, pump hydro storage, and all those things. But the regulations are still not clear on that, how we are going to address their treatment in the regulatory framework. We are working on that, but unless until they come out, we are waiting for others in the other across the globe, how others are trying to address this system, whether they are doing it through market-based mechanism or regulatory-based mechanism. That is one thing we have to learn from the Western world, because they are slightly advanced in this type of work. The things which we have already identified and done also has to be acknowledged and strengthened. Like, for example, to create more demand, we have this regulations of rooftop solar, which is already there. As we discussed, must-run status has been provided to the renewables. Then the renewable purchase obligation, which mandates all the distribution companies as well as open access consumers to have a certain % of their energy requirement met from the renewable sources. So the RPO obligations have been formulated through the regulations. Scheduling, forecasting, I have already mentioned. Then there are many small, because of the decentralized nature of this renewable generation, there are many small generators have come in picture. For them to have scheduling, forecasting, etc. is very cost prohibitive business. So to facilitate that, the regulations which have come up is to allow them to participate through the QCA, the Qualified Coordinating Agency, which does the scheduling and forecasting on their behalf, and then settles among its participants. For market development of the green energy, I think the new products like GTAM, etc. is already in the power exchanges. But we are yet to move on the forward market for the green energy. Unless until forward market or derivatives, etc. are introduced, the investments, they will have some sort of hiccups. The new concept which we have recently introduced is green tariff for those consumers who are environmentally conscious and those who have got their ESG commitments to the business community. The green tariff have been introduced by a few states, including mine, and Maharashtra is also one of the, and there are many other states which have introduced this concept of green tariff, whereby you pay a certain extra premium which is towards meeting the cost of the green energy balancing the grid, and then whatever you consume, it can be certified to be a green one. Actually, it is fungible because it is not, one-to-one parity, the electron-wise parity is not there, but in overall sense, it gives you some sort of satisfaction. Peer-to-peer energy trading, we have already said that between prosumers and consumers, it is a very, very interesting concept, and we are fortunate to have introduced the pilot in our state, whereby the prosumers and consumers based on blockchain technology, they could transact energy in between them. It is win-win for everyone in the sense because the prosumers, they in the net gross metering, they get something like 2 to 3 rupees from the distribution companies, and the CNI consumers, their tariff is 8 rupee. In this, the prosumer can directly send its energy to the CNI industry by paying certain wheeling and distribution charges to the distribution company as well as to the peer-to-peer blockchain portal. So everyone saves and makes money. Then we, through regulations, have been providing support for banking to the green energy generating companies. Thereby, because, you know, as we know, solar, etc., they come during the daytime only, whereby the load is throughout the day. And if they want to use that generated power in the night time, they can do it. Either they have to set up their own storage unit, or they store it in the grid through the distribution company, and distribution company allows them to withdraw. The new green energy open access rule, which has been notified by the central government, also provides for that. Although it is not a pure 100% green energy withdrawal when the banked energy is withdrawal, but that concept promotes some sort of incentive to the green energy generators. The main aspect on which we are yet to work is introduction of tariff measures like time of the use or time of the day tariff, whereby we can, you know, give price signal to the various consumer category. Why I'm saying that this is most critical, because when we'll have the vehicle to e-mobility burden shifted in on the grid, there is going to be huge pressure on the grid. India annually sells more than 3.3 million cars, and even if by 2030, if we presume 25% of that will be electric, I had made a rough calculation. The battery charging requirement, even if we presume 60 kilowatt hours, then we'll need at least 75,000 megawatt to meet to the charging requirement if everyone charges simultaneously. So that will put unnecessary cost and burden on the grid, and we need to have a proper policy measures so we can introduce concepts like time of the use or time of the day metering, so that our load is dispersed and there are incentive to the consumer to use their EV charging in off-peak hours, etc. So these regulations we have to come up with. The other challenges which we are facing is, right now the government is, it is promoting renewable energy, there is no two doubt about it. But so far the financial support which is provided may not be sufficient to meet its commitment. Because it says that renewables are basically location specific and intermittent in nature. So if you want to set up wind-based power plants, it is necessarily going to be in 4 or 5 states of the coastal India. And the load center are throughout the country, then you need to set up a huge transmission line from your wind generating plants to the load center. The government says that we'll provide you free ISTS. Now what is this free ISTS? Free ISTS is nothing but cross-subsidization of the tariff. Basically, the taxpayers' burden is shifted on the ratepayers. So there is no additionality being earmarked to the sector. So we need to address this drawback if we want the real money to flow into the system. Otherwise, the existing consumers will have to pay for the whole transition, and then it may not take place in the desired pace. The another challenge is that it is the economic development of any country which will drive its green energy transition. Because green energy transition has got a cost, as it has been said by Mr. Pujari, and that cost has to be met out of the per capita income. Now, India's per capita income, say in dollar terms, say even if you take it as $2,500, it is not in position to absorb more than 4 to 5% of its per capita income on energy. Otherwise, it is going to be a trade-off with other developmental aspects. So that thing has to be done, that we can achieve the same level of development which the Western or developed country can achieve in a shorter time, but it is going to take a longer time for us because we have to reach that per capita level to meet that obligation. And then there are issues related to technical minimum of the thermal power plant, etc., etc. These are technical things. We are not going to go into that area. And the most critical one, of course, we have always been talking about is low penetration of the smart metering. If we want to have time of use or time of day metering concept or other improved grid performance, then we must have the smart metering penetration, deeper penetration for that. I think these are the areas I think we need to address through our regulations and policy measures if we want a rapid integration of the renewables in the grid and move forward on the net zero plan. Thank you.
Thank you, R.P. Singh ji. You've flagged a bunch of topics that I think we will get to in the discussion, I hope. But I will pick on just one or two because you rightly observed that RE is not your average electricity. It has intermittency, locational, and variability. And intermittency and variability are actually distinct. So we need something else or storage which is expensive and so forth. So I did not actually go through my remarks because I'm going to mix them up. I have some prepared remarks, but instead, to organically build on points made, you mentioned you have a green tariff in UP, Maharashtra has one. How many of you here have taken a green tariff? Very few.
The green tariff as a supplier of
Retail. Okay. Now, how many of you here have an electric vehicle? A couple of hands go up. How many of you plug in your electric vehicle in the day primarily? Because that's when you have the most and cheapest electricity, at least from an Indian case, for example, solar. That drops dramatically. And so this issue is a very key one because as we've heard from our chair and Singh, in the old days we were tinkering at the edge. We're adding a little bit of RE. You could blend it, absorb it, but that's not going to be the case with, forget 2070 when it's 100% at that point, or 2050 like you said for the power sector. But even by 2030, it's meant to be half your energy, roughly. So now, how do we manage that, A, at the policy side, TOD pricing or time of use, time of day, but also to understand the implications. So this concept of banking is just one I'm flagging, and I'll share a thought exercise. If you visit Cochin Airport, you will see a sign proudly proclaiming world's first 100% solar airport. How many of you have seen that or know about it? Yep, number of fans. They don't have any batteries, and they don't shut down the airport at night. So what are they doing? They're doing exactly what you said, which is grid-based banking. In this particular case, it's not a physical offset, it's an accounting-based offset, which means, in theory, if you do an annual averaging like in that model, in total, in the day, such a user is going to over-generate solar, give it to the grid, and then in the evening, take it back from the grid, maybe at a notional banking charge. Because as of now, most banking policies that I know of in India are not very steep. They're not linked to an inherent cost structure of TOD. They're a notional banking charge. This works up to a point. And the rhetorical question I'll end with on this thread for now is we want to be very careful that we're not socializing, to use this point about transmission that you had said, we're not socializing inefficiently or unfairly which at the extreme means we're cross-subsidizing the rich. And that's a severe risk with rooftop solar. When you give a capital subsidy of 40%, it's an issue if you have public charging infrastructure, which would be used for four-wheelers by the rich relative to the average citizen, and so forth. So these are just some thoughts as we get to our discussion round. And now I will turn to Professor Jean-Michel Glachin and ask him to speak a little bit about regulatory aspects, maybe from Europe, but also general, and just open with one observation as we look at regulation. As an academic, as a professor, one of the things we teach our students and general textbooks say, if I want to regulate, be it any commodity or any entity item, you can either set a volume and discover prices, that's what trading schemes are about, or you set a tax or a price, and that'll change your volumes that you get out of your system. Traditionally, that's a bifurcation some people think of. Now, on top of this, we have additional instruments which are not related to a price of externality. We do not yet have a carbon price in India, but we have pseudo-carbon prices. We have a coal cess, we have petrol taxes. If you relabel your petrol taxes, which are very high, you know, as the old joke goes, state budgets are alive on two liquids taxation. You know, one goes in the petrol tank and one sort of can be consumed. Then these are things that are at risk with the transition, the fiscal implication. And so, just to give you one number, how much should a carbon price be? I'm not hoping to get into carbon pricing as a debate, but the world, IEA has recommendations on what is a meaningful, quote unquote, carbon price. The world is talking of $100 a ton or higher, if you look at damages, functions, and stuff. For India, people have said maybe you should do $25 a ton CO2. If you translate $25 per ton CO2 to koila, to coal, that comes to just under 3 rupees a kilowatt hour price increase. So we'll get to it from your discussions. Do we think that that's bearable from an end, perspective? So with these remarks, request Jean-Michel to...
For how long?
Well, in theory, 10 minutes, but a smart system is meant to be flexible, so. I mean, if you take more now, then that'll leave less time for later, next rounds.
Ladies, gentlemen, the first thing I would like to do is to thank Rajesh Pillai and Indian Smart Grid Forum for this invitation. It is the first time I am back in India since 4 years, and I'm extremely happy. I have to say publicly that I love your country, of course less than you, but I really deeply, sincerely love your country and its inhabitants. I was going to thank Rahul because at the first reading of the title, I saw zero regulation, so no regulation, for power sector, and I thought, wow, interesting topic. And then I started to prepare, seeing regulations with a Z for net zero power sector. And I thought, oh my God. After 2 hours to speak 10 minutes, it was not finished. So I had to take a decision. Decision is the following. I will tell you that logically, seen from Europe, there are 4 different steps in going to net zero. And each step is a particular case for regulations. What are the 4 steps? The first one, you inject green electricity into the existing system, and you keep the system as it is, and it will work. Of course it will work, why not? It becomes, and it has consequences, but it becomes more difficult when you inject a large amount of renewable power. And that's where we are entering into the EU, and we are scratching our head, shit. We cannot keep the system as it is. We cannot keep the markets as they are. We have to adapt them to the bulk power being renewable. It's not the same thing. But it's not ending. Why? Because changing electricity where it is already consumed is relatively easy, even if challenging. The big difficulties are coming on other parts. Consumers can invest. When they invest, they don't care about the electricity system. And you have to consider that you have a two-level electricity system. And many changes are coming from this fact, but consumers are voters, so it's not easy to walk on their feet. Fourth step, you want to decarbonize any energy consumption. So you want to decarbonize what is not electrified. What is not electrified is not electrified. So you have to ask the consumers to invest into new assets, new processes, new behavior. And you have to promise that they will be served at a regular price. Good luck. I have time only for the two first steps. First of all, small amount of decarbonized electricity in existing system. Very easy, but since the start, what mechanism do you use to push investment? We tried a market for green certificates. It doesn't push investment much. So we tried something else, long-term public contracts, and they did work. So we started to push renewable by renewable support schemes. It's a regulation, it's not very market-friendly. Second, we push investments via support schemes, therefore the money is not coming from the market for energy. So the renewables are not linked with the market for energy. They are not linked with the system operation. It does not work well. So we had to change even this. We tried to link more the renewables revenue with the market for energy. We found this astuce. This astuce is a premium. You have the market revenues plus a premium. And then blah, 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 blah. But even with this, we have another challenge. As the revenues from the market for energy are lower, traditional generators cannot get enough revenue from the market for energy. And they are threatening to leave or to be less available. Then we found another remedy, capacity market. So you have revenues from the energy market, and we create a capacity market to give you complementary revenue. Fourth thing, is this capacity market able to drive enough innovation, enough diversity of assets? Because we have still the whole electricity system to be well equipped, not obvious, and people running the capacity market, most of the time transmission system operators, are becoming the policy makers. It is not anymore the Minister of Energy making the energy policy, it is the transmission system operator, while the transmission system operator is taking only care of reliability officially, but in fact, it is driving energy policy. That's the first step only. We enter into the second one, large amounts of renewable. In EU, we have already 1/3. We are targeting a second third in this decade. How will it work? Everything has been conceived for generating units being dispatchable, but units are not dispatchable anymore. How will it work? The whole electricity system has to be, in a sense, planified, because we have to be sure that we have enough assets of various types to make electricity system still working. This is really a change of philosophy. Plus, we have new assets to be activated, flexibility. Consumption can go up, can go down. It can become an asset, but we have to find the rules and the rewards. Storage, it has been said by Mr. Pujari. Second, we have to build active cooperation between transmission and distribution. Distribution was quietly pushing energy towards the consumer. Now, distribution has two types of flows, generation and consumption, and is becoming a system operator in itself. As distribution companies are becoming system operators, we have two types of system operators, distribution level, transmission level. How do they combine, where there is a congestion, where there is some crisis? Next, the system value of a generation asset is not told by the asset, it is told by the system. So the system has to assess what is the true generating value of each type of technology. And this has to be put into the markets. Day-ahead market, we can claim that tomorrow we will deliver this, deliver that, but a dispatchable plant will not deliver the same product like a panel. So we have to review the way the markets, the existing old markets, value energy, value capacity, value everything from energy to pure reserve. Second, with a massive renewable system, you have to guarantee the speed because we have target of decarbonization. You have incredible target in India too, but we have to guarantee the speed. Do we have mechanisms to guarantee the speed of decarbonization? It's not voluntary decision taken by investors. I have excellent relation with Mr. Sinha, Tata Power, but Mr. Sinha is responsible for India. We have other people being responsible. How do they guarantee the speed of decarbonization? In EU, we are now saying, oh, we have to go to new contracts. We call it contract for differences. Public authorities every year will open auctioning of capacity. Every year, every year, every year. Okay, but then the public authorities are planning the electricity system, are responsible for the planning. How do they provide the right technologies? How do they provide the right amount of technology? How do they push innovation in technologies? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Third big thing in massive renewable system, price shocks. As renewable are variable, intermittent, they cannot guarantee to serve all the time. So inevitably, we will have price shocks because we will lose something else, either gas in the EU or hydrogen if you produce a lot, or anything else. You will use other technology to face scarcity. At scarcity moment, when everything is difficult, it is not renewable fixing the price, it is something else. So you have enormous price shocks that the price shocks we have, you will face. How to face it vis-à-vis consumers? How to protect consumers for these big prices? And to finish, because my phone is ringing, we have volume shocks to come. Volume shocks like we have weather shock, we have an enormous cold, enormous heat, enormous dry season with no water. How do we face all of this? You can tell me, well, they are price shocks. No, they are more than price shocks because if you cannot deliver to the country, you have chaos, you have blackout. All of this has to be foreseen, organized. And you remember that I didn't say anything about decentralized generation owned by consumers. I didn't say anything about decarbonizing the non-electricity consumption, the cars, the houses, and the industry. Thank you.
It was, so our metric was not minutes, but quality, so therefore, And yes, it was in time, yes. So, lots of points came up, and I liked your 4 steps that you laid out, but they get harder and harder. Yeah. And that comes back to the point of a premium that may be required for this, and who's going to pay, or how do we apportion it. But I think one very subtle point that I want to emphasize is the value will not be set by the generator saying, I am X rupees per kilowatt hour. Typically, that is how we've done our bids. Levelized cost of energy, LCOE. But that ignores system effects, impacts on others. It typically ignores time of day. So it treats that you'll run at a notional or normative load factor or capacity factor. And that is clearly not the way to have a modern system. So I think that is a very, very important point that you flagged, that we have 2 issues for India. It's not that we don't recognize it. The question is, A, what will that look like? Because there will be change from today. And second, how do we manage that change in terms of winners and losers? Because there's an old joke. Everyone hates monopolies unless you are one. So similarly, PPAs are reviled because of the lock-in they give you. But if you have a PPA, you hold it for dear life because it's bankability. You can take it to a financier saying that, look, I've cut down my risk because there's a guaranteed offtake, fixed cost coverage for 2-part tariffs, for example. But will that scale, will that last? Or are we going to hit curtailment? Are we going to hit Section 11, backing down, and all of these things? So very important points we'll get to in the discussions. If I could now invite Shri R.N. Sen, who is our regulator in West Bengal, to share opening remarks. Thank you. And thank you. Mr. Sen also used to run and still runs a very interesting newsletter on Energy Connect. So I urge everyone to
subscribe it.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I thank Smart Grid Mr. Regipil is here himself for inviting me in this August gathering. All my delegates and distinguished panelists. I'll be taking you to a different road now. We have been debating about the regulations and all those things, the need of the thing. I am here going to present on microgrid. The microgrid is basically what we have been seeing and thinking and experiencing is going through a sea change. And what I feel, it is going to really future of the energy transit of this country. Once I say this, I'll go through first what, just very, all of you must be knowing very well, but I am not really, trying to educate you all those things, but just have a couple of brush up and then we'll go to the, what we are really going to debate on that.
You have to point that way. Yeah.
He's going to some other? Yeah.
Yeah. Now next, yeah.
You just jump one. Anyway. Yeah. Now, just if you go quickly on what is microgrid, you can see it is a basically small power supply network for supplying to small community. And now we are talking about the enable the local generators with high flexibility and efficiency. The idea, it should be connected both to the local generators and the utility grid, thus preventing power outage, and also excess power can be sold to the grid. The size of the microgrid may be small villages to municipality region, including reliability and quality power consumer like data center, military establishment, hospital, industrial consumer, commercial establishment, etc. And one of the major role what microgrid is going to play is the integrator for all those small generators which are going to come in future due to different technology innovation. Just now when I was talking to Mr. BP Singh, He was telling they have been given an innovation award to IIT, I think Roorkee or somebody else, who came out with this micro wind turbines, which can be mounted any household roof, maybe generating a few kilowatts, and do not require any quality wind. Similarly, a lot of new technologies are going to come, which are going to give power, maybe in kilowatt hours, and not more than, say, few megawatts, if maximum that may be. So this is what is going to. Now, what are the components? It is basically the distributed generation, certainly, like solar, biogas, wind, wave turbine generators, mini, micro, hydro generators, etc. Whatever we can think, whatever we can see, these are all going to come, and they are going to create more and more complexity in the whole grid and problem for all the regulators and the policymakers. But anyway, this is the need of the hour. The local consumer, you should have a consumer which are local, so that they really save the ATN losses, they save the hassles of going through the different, long grid network and disturbance which may come due to the natural calamity and other things. The point of common coupling, the utility grid, controller, certainly it will be one of the major things which has to come out. Storage both in immediate and long term. That is a very big question, how we are going to address the cost of storage. Smart meters, distribution networks, smart technology. Now, as these things are going to be very, very, distributed, micro, mini, complex, so the only thing which can integrate them is the smart technology. That's why we are coming here in this ISGF platform, where the smart technology will be really in a position to integrate them. Why you need it? Easily needed it basically in remote areas where the utility grid was not reached. Now we are talking to the quality power consumers. That itself is still there, but that needs it slowly, basically is getting addressed by the utility grid reaching in most of the part of the country. Due to local factor, transmission, distribution loss and capital and maintenance cost reduces. So it becomes really quite cost effective. It may not be because of the capacity of the generators, but because of the local factors. Environment friendly, reducing ATN losses, greenhouse gases emission. Then it also encourages RE generators to sale of surplus power to the grid, and it becomes basically a platform for sell, integrate, and then address all those issues which we will be facing in years to come. Provide high quality and reliable power to the critical loads. Can operate from small patch of land, it can be a small village hut to avoid large land uses. Now these are the conventional versus microgrid. I think I will not be going through all those things. These are already written here. You can just have a quick look, because all of must be you knowing that what is exactly the problem with the conventional grid. The microgrid advantage I will just in Sundarban areas in West Bengal, there is a huge cyclone which basically devastated the whole Sundarban and larger part of even Kolkata. The conventional grid supply in part of Kolkata, it takes 3 to 4 days. In my area, which is one of the most posh area, it immediately gets it, but it took 3 days to restore the power supply. In Sundarban areas, it took about 4 to 5 weeks sometimes. But whenever there's number of microgrids were there, what are the villages, about 20 villages, 20 microgrids were there, they came up in the next day morning giving power to everybody. Next day morning, because the whole night there was a storm and cyclones. By the time next day morning came, they just put back the position and then. So it really addresses all those things which are going to face, and we are facing already, and we may be facing much more severe in future days to come. Then during peak load period, microgrid may get separated from the utility grid, and thus reduces the chances of utility grid failure. Because if the utility grid gets loaded and loaded and loaded, then microgrid separates all those loads which are basically just like the way we have in our distribution network also, and where the under frequency relays and this get separated. So similarly, the microgrids also take care, and they have their own source. They may have their own battery system, may have the gas generators, they may have fuel cells, they have so many things which are going to come and which are already existing. And at least immediately they address the need of the power. Microgrid empowers the consumer to sell surplus power and peak power from their car battery. This is going to come up in a big way. The car battery is going to play a major source of power during peak hours, consume powers during off-peak hours, and so on. For storage in micro battery is required, which is both voluminous and expensive. It's very, challenging job for the microgrid owners will have to look. Resynchronization of the microgrid with the main grid is difficult because we know those who have been generating stations don't know how difficult it is to resynchronize with the main grid. Nowadays, fully automated things are not that, but in my good old days, we used to stand in the control room, and the frequency synchronous meter used to come and just jump, and come and jump. I don't know those who have been in a generating stage, they have seen. It used to be and it is a challenge. Now, if you go through the technology, things will be wiped out. Implementation of microgrid protection is one of the most important challenges being forced by the microgrid operators. Huge amount of protections, other things will be required. As you all know, the challenges will be too many. For ensuring utility grid connectivity to microgrid operators, will have to pay, today what we are paying, they have to pay standby charges, they have to pay net metering in case of then the injection beyond that will be free. So a lot of things are there, those have to be addressed. Interconnection standards are to be developed to maintain consistency. Sudden change in generation source of RE will bring the challenges because all of us know the RE generators, as of today, we are facing huge challenges, whether it is a solar or wind. Wind, those who are from the southern part of the country, they have seen that it goes up like anything in the night, and then it suddenly vanishes. In the solar, maybe it has a timeline, which we know very well, but suddenly the cloud comes, it falls down drastically. So, and so many other things were going to come. Now, once saying all these things, basically we have to look into selecting the appropriate microgrid solution. The process of selecting the appropriate microgrid solution for a given location can be very complex and challenging. Now we are not talking about a microgrid which is basically was a remote part of the country, in a remote place, which was basically only thought of this is to be done. We are not talking, we are talking about something which is really address our energy transit. Give reliable and quality power to the military, to the data center, all those things. The number of roadblocks arises and which any of them may basically derail the whole decision process of microgrid. Determining the desired application for a given location. Now, an excellent method to cut through the problem is to determine a location where power load requirement and the time of a standby solution must provide backup power in the event of a grid outage. Where really people require, where people do not require power even any time and every time, whatever comes, it is okay. The way we still now treating most of our villages, they may not be requiring a power standby capacity, but where it is really a must, so microgrid will be an option which will really help them. Suppose a significant grid outages, more than few hours, would be detrimental to the site. In that case, a resilient, dispatchable prime power architecture generator used as a standby power is needed. Determining the desired application for a given location. Once the decision is made, other components of the overall solution, such as supplemental power for renewables or additional revenue for the market play, can be evaluated. The market play revenue could come from demand management programs or dispatching the resilient standby sources into market opportunities. That's like you may have some gas generation facility. You have a biogas, the biogas has a generating facility, which you have. Now you can also use it for like this. Similarly, the battery sources. So, by taking these factors into account, decision makers can determine the desired application of the microgrid and identify the best solution. Concentration of electric vehicle may provide standby power source to the battery. Difficulty in forecasting benefit. The microgrid power solution can be challenging to forecast. As it is all renewable based, we know renewable is highly unpredictable in some of the time, and this becomes a bigger challenge to the microgrid operators. While a given size load profile is likely to somewhat repetitive, demand requirement may frequently occur at unpredictable time and magnitude. As well, utility rates and demand program incentivize can vary in periods and volume shorter than the desired period of the concentration of the overall solution, creating a deterioration of certainty of inputs in a study to consider and justify microgrid as a power solution. So right now we have been discussing all our, earlier speakers, they have told all those problems related with renewable energy and how to address it, how difficult, how. So those challenges are getting more and more magnified in the case of microgrid. A simple remedy for this solution is to source an energy as a service or microgrid as a service solution. Let us not look to microgrid as only one solution. And you start with then you move at it. In addition, as a service approach reduces the risks for both the site and the solution provider and can often include maintenance in the comprehensive agreement. Further, decision makers must consider quantitative analysis to look at financial modeling, life cycle cost analysis, and risk management. This approach can provide a more comprehensive understanding of the potential benefits, including cost saving, increased energy security, and reduced environment impact. Policy and regulatory support required. Now we come back to all those things which have been, right now we have been debating. These are all the support which the microgrid also be requiring. Regulatory provision will be required for treating microgrid operator as a consumer, and they may be protected through a standard of SOP regulation. So they should not be treated as a commercial consumer or something like that. They should be treated as a common consumer, and all those protections are to be given. Similarly, the connectivity with the main grid and import and export of RE energy may be based on net billing in place of net metering. Because in place of net metering, what happens, the excess power goes more or less free of cost. And it should be based on the average cost of supply of the distribution licensee. Present regulation notified by the CERC mainly on the protection of the microgrid in case of utility grid supply start in that microgrid control areas, which needs a relook to new dimensions. Policy support in the form of upfront subsidy. Now, this is what is basically required because microgrid is going to give a main vehicle for transition into this renewable energy. Policy support in the front of upfront subsidy may also be considered for the microgrid consumer in the line with that a consumer of distribution licensee based on percentage of low and marginal consumer are drawing power from the microgrid. Because when you give a subsidy to the consumers, the other consumer pay for it. Whether you take a grid to about say 100 or 200 or 300 kilometers away, where the consumption is very meager, we pay substantially high price for the capital cost. Similarly, the AT&C losses are very high. Then we subsidize it through, say, about 30 or 40%, or maybe what the Electricity Act say plus minus 20%. But still, if some of them are really given to the microgrid based on a certain policy and certainly it will become, basically we have to look into how to make it viable, both technically and commercially viable. Also, the saving made from the AT&C losses, reduction in transmission and distribution network may also be shared to make this endeavor affordable and sustainable. With amendment of Electricity Act, there will be no need for distribution licensing. Yeah, I'm just. So the microgrid may be treated as in line with the existing provision, and they will be free to sell and purchase of power. Similarly, after transferring the transmission asset, which Government of India has written to every states, the 11 kV and above, the distribution license to state transmission utility, the open access of import and export power will be less barriers. I mean, this is what we are already government has taken. I am not saying what. Regulatory provision will be required for treating microgrid operators as a consumer and they may be protected, also already it has been done. Yeah. Now, benefits of microgrid to the country. Summarize, yeah. So, meeting the energy commitment made by the government at various international platforms like COP26, where we have made a commitment and whether we like it or not, it has to be maintained. And it has to be really seen it is happening. Already things started happening, but in a very slow space, which doesn't really give us the comfort that we'll be doing it. Minimize the energy requirement due to reduction in energy losses. The total overall consumption of the energy goes reduced for the same amount of work, because today in India, distribution losses are varying from 10–15% in case of some of the private utilities, up to the 40 to 50% in case of some of the state utilities. So those energy will be really saving. So we will not be generating carbon from those energies. Minimize the import of energy, as the majority of the energy requirement will be made through RE, does a step towards Atmanirbhar Bharat, because we are spending huge amount of money for the import of oil and coal also. So that money can be saved drastically. Empowerment of local entrepreneurs and employment opportunities, thus ensuring all-around development of rural economy. Because microgrids will be localized, they will be requiring the local entrepreneur, the local people will be engaged, and now it will not be very centralized location, it will be across the whole country. Opportunity to integrate various micro, mini generators at common platform, thus harnessing the types of RE generator for abating the control of a common goal.
I think we can discuss this in the next.
Okay, so thank you very much. Basically, I have brought the paper for this discussion here, because once you're looking for a net zero certainly lot of large-scale RE generators will have to be there, but if we keep on integrating the mini and micro, which is spread across the country, and also with the new technological breakthroughs, new technological initiatives, they have to give a platform. And micro is a platform which will enable all of them to come together and address it. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you. So I think it's important to rethink of the definitional aspects of what a microgrid is. As you pointed out, at one end, you've got large-scale RE, then you've got rooftop solar at one end, but there will be a place to play in between, which shouldn't be viewed as only those traditional standalone microgrids for a village. That's not what we're really talking about. And I think the concepts of federation, constellations, interactive, think of campuses, think of tech parks. You have IT companies or campuses of corporates. Those could become a microgrid of a different type. And the larger point that I think is being flagged, I'm extrapolating from yours, is behind the meter technologies. And this is a challenge for regulators because they don't have visibility to how much consumption is going through self-generation if you're dealing with only net metering, because all you see is the net amount going into the grid. You don't know what's happening. And that's a challenge from a planning perspective. As an anecdote, Western Australia, 1 out of 2 homes has solar rooftop now. Now, obviously, we are not there yet as India, but maybe we'll get there in some years because solar is attractive. How will that be regulated? How will that be managed? Are larger questions that we need to cover. So thank you. If I could now request Chris to share his remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about the regulatory perspectives going on in the United States. I want to thank Smart Grid Forum for inviting me, and Reggie again for inviting me out here again. This is my 4th time participating, 3rd time here in India to participate in this great conference. And since this is in March, it gets me away from my home, which is in the state of Minnesota, where it is heavily snowing right now. So I'm very happy to be in some warm weather.
Do you have a heat pump?
No, because heat pumps are still on the borderline for my weather area, because we can get to...
We'll discuss that after.
We'll have that later. So what I want to talk about is actually building on something off the previous speaker about the challenges going on right now. And I want to start with the word complexity, because the grid is becoming more complex. And it's that complexity that is exposing how fragile the system itself is as well as the regulatory and operational constructs in which we all operate, which the utilities and the regulators operate under. And when I talk about the complexity, it implies several different things. First, because we are in the midst of a transition where we are relying on more wind and more solar, more flexible resources, more flexible demand, that has a challenge to how the system has traditionally been operated. We have a traditional system that has run for over 100 years on a power plant built far away and delivering power one way to the consumer. Now we're allowing power to be generated at the other end of the system and be sent back up into distribution, and then that in an aggregate has an impact on the transmission system. These are things that no one planned for. As a result of that, we have solutions that were put in place that may no longer work. So one of the challenges that we're having in the United States right now is, I'll call it a crisis of faith regarding our faith in markets. As one of the very strongly pro-market persons who works with state commissions around the country, recognizing that the federal regulator and the state regulators are now losing their faith in the ability of markets to successfully transition ourselves to a system based more on renewables to reach a net zero future, that becomes a challenge, because now we no longer have necessarily the price signals that we rely upon for investors to go make a decision. We lose the price signals for the consumer to go out and decide whether this is an investment they want to make or a contract they want to sign. We're having debates on whether we should just mandate everything and allow the utility to do it all. Is that going to be a simpler, easier way to do this? Again, as a market-based person, I disagree. I think allowing customer choice, allowing markets to discover prices and figure out what are the best solutions to meet our demands and needs are a more efficient way of doing this. But because of experiences we've had in the United States around certain market-based solutions and certain regions of the country, people are less certain whether that is an adequate solution going forward. Another challenge we have is, again, the strain between state and federal government. We have a federal government, the federal regulator, who's looking at enabling markets on the one hand and wholesale markets, but on the other hand, really restricting what the states can do inside the state as how it impacts wholesale markets. We have states that are responding to federal directives to go out and invest in clean energy or to enable new markets for new distributed resources. And you have the monopolies going in and passing laws of the states that prohibit or make it very difficult for those markets to actually take place on the retail side. And so it becomes a really convoluted way of trying to manage this system based on this complexity. And the last thing I'll mention around this complexity is that it also shows how fragile the system is itself. We have, on the distribution side, we have a system that has not been updated since the 70s or the 80s. So now we're having a system that's on the edge of no longer being able to adequately provide service. Regardless of what happens on the transmission side or regardless of what happens on generation, if the distribution system is not available to deliver electricity, then we have a problem. And what's been going on in the States is utilities have been asking for billions of dollars in new investment to build new distribution. But again, we go back to this market question. Should the utilities be building it to meet its own needs, or is the system to be built in a different way than it has been in the past? Does the system get built in a way that enables and embraces the growth of distributed energy resources and renewables and storage and electric vehicles? Does it embrace this change that the consumer is actively looking for regarding new options and new choices for themselves, or are we just going to allow the utility to be the only provider of these solutions? And I think, again, this embraces the complexity challenge that the regulators, not only in the United States but around the world, are facing around this change. And I think having these conversations around how to address this complexity and how does it pace itself over time, I think is a really important conversation that federal regulators and state regulators need to address. Because while India has a 2070, in the United States, every state has that responsibility. So my state of Minnesota just passed a bill this last month putting us on a 100% by 2050 or 2040. Question is that actually going to happen? Is that a meaningful goal if we don't have a system in place to actually allow us to reach that target? and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So in fact, this flags an interesting question on path forward. Now, I'll just set some timings. We started half an hour late. I will not try and use it all because that's not fair to our audience, but I do want some discussion and Q&A, so hopefully we can keep our remarks shorter, so more back and forth, if I could request everyone. Now, you talked about how do we scale this up, so meaningful targets, which prompts the first question. And these are open to everyone. Are targets the right way forward? In the sense, you have, for example, in India, RPOs, renewable purchase obligations. And then you could, for example, apportion the RPO across the states, which is what MNRE has done historically, the Renewables Ministry. Is that the most efficient or market-aligned mechanism? I mean, is that the one that's going to get the most investment? Is that the one that's going to scale? Is one set of questions. And I'll leave it there for this.
I think we had some discussion on that with the ministry. Actually, what the ministry has outlined is a one-size-fits-all approach whereby it had compartmentalized the targets for each and every state to be uniformly attained. Now, the problem is that the resources are not uniformly located. As we all know that wind is located in few coastal states only. And the hydro potential is also limited to few states. The solar radiation also varies from state to state. So this one-size-fits-all approach, which has been so far proposed by the ministry, in my opinion, is not either a fair one or a correct way forward to attain the target. Second thing is, again, depends upon the policy measures, right? We always think that the renewables are cheaper because we are comparing only the cost of generation X bus. That means from where it is being injected into the grid. But there are a lot of other associated costs which are getting into that. So those are getting blurred because of various policy measures which have been announced. Like, for example, what we have been saying is ISTS, free ISTS and all those things. Besides that, there is a cost which the distribution companies are already bearing because they had, in anticipation of meeting certain developmental goal, they had contracted the long-term power purchase capacity. But this must-run status of the renewables is causing a standard cost to them. So this all is making the whole transition path more expensive. So instead of following a prescribed approach, we should have something which is related to each and every state's capacity, how much it can absorb and, sell to its consumer. That would have been a better policy measure. However, we are yet to move on that trajectory. So this is my take on the RPO.
So in fact, Jean-Michel had mentioned RECs or renewable energy certificates, they didn't really take off. So that would not be the way to equalize that issue. So we know that not only is RE not the same as historical energy, even all RE itself is not the same. Wind and solar are different, locations are different, etc. So we now have to look at several layers of change in the regulations, starting from TOD, which itself could be bifurcated between wholesale and retail. So one of the questions is, which is the chicken, which is the egg, towards reflecting grid condition to this, either new supply or to consumption, both sides. Second, we have to figure out this issue of what is green and what is banking and so forth, which is linked. I mean, the other sort of takeaway I have is this is like a balloon. You cannot just squeeze here if there's a leak, because that's going to press somewhere else. Third, we have to figure out the issue of fixed and variable costs, because in the supply side, we have two-part tariff for thermal, but a single part, there's no fuel for renewables. Consumers, we by many measures, have a lower fixed cost for most consumers, and more costs are put into the variable, which then increases the risk of them exiting for renewables. And then, coming from microgrids or similar mechanisms, how do we regulate peer-to-peer? Doesn't have to be through blockchain, it could be, but any edge-based transaction. So if I have a big storage because I feel I need it, can I give it to my neighbor? Meaning, can I give some power from it to my neighbor? Or will the state tell me, no, you don't have a license, or no, this is what you have to pay for that, and are we setting this up efficiently? So there's so many layers of change. So the open question is, where do we start? What is either low-hanging fruit, or what needs to be done first, because otherwise the other things may not. Any international thoughts, Enrique or Chris or anyone? Yeah.
Okay, I'm taking a leap in the dark here, but I guess it gives everyone time to think. Yeah, no, I think where do you start? I think taking this kind of complexity perspective and taking your analogy of the steps. I think right now, I work in the private sector, policy making, so I'm kind of in the first step, how you get more green energy in the system. But when we think of like 2030, 2040, this is literally tomorrow when we think that developing the power system, 5 years, I mean, in Europe it's 11 years and 10, by the time you build your plant that you got permitted, it's already obsolete, right? So if you really want to prepare a system for mass net zero, you need to start working today, and you need to kind of ensure that regulation and policy making exists outside of kind of the silos where, it's the energy ministry that sets a target, but for example, it takes time to train all the people to install the new technologies. It takes time to develop the data capabilities, for example, to build the data literacy when you're thinking of really managing the system as a whole. So I think on the one hand side is kind of changing how we run the power systems, but we need to already start preparing now to how we're going to think about a power system. There's not only power system, but it needs to be planning in conjunction with transport, for example, with heating, with cooling, for example, and that's a whole new different challenge, right? So I think you have to start on two ends, the strategy end, setting the capabilities, and also,
Tactical.
Yeah.
No, I think I like that capacity building, human capacity and framework capacity building are probably first steps. And then what I hear, or maybe I'm interpreting, is that we also need simulations and modeling for a lot of things that haven't been built, because we don't have counterfactuals. You cannot say that, oh, grid design or market design A is superior to B, because we haven't built those. And so analytic frameworks that are transparent and consistent are probably going to be quite important. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, money. A lot of this, I'm going to paraphrase something I hear from industrial consumers and friends. They may not be fully right. I'm not claiming they are. Oh my gosh, solar, 2 rupees a kilowatt hour. And gosh darn, I'm paying, what, 11 rupees a kilowatt hour, 9 rupees a kilowatt hour as a premium C&I consumer. That to me seems like a recipe for breaking the equilibrium we have today. And right now that equilibrium is tenuously held through a range of uncertainty, add-on charges, wheeling charges. In some states, you have a requirement for an isolated feeder if you want open access. So 1 megawatt size, in some states have demanded a dedicated feeder, which of course takes time. But now with green open access, the regulation is now down to 100 kilowatt. So I don't think you can or should ask for a dedicated feeder. So the question then becomes, how do we keep the equilibrium alive as we have moving targets and shifts, but at the same time don't hold back the promise or premise of cleaner technologies, which can be cheaper as well?
As far as the cost is concerned, we will accept this has a cost. It has a cost. Now let us think a situation, we don't have any commitment for the environment, there is no threat of greenhouse gases, nothing. Still then shall we go for a renewable or not? That is a big question. First we have to understand it. Now coming back to our country. Today around 20% of our power is coming from renewable. Let us take say about 10%, suppose in absence of proper renewable energy, at least 10% energy has to come from again fossil fuel. So if the renewable is pegged down to 10% and the 10% has to come from fossil fuel, the moment it has to come from the fossil fuel, either coal or fuel oil or something like that, which is already is very highly priced. Because we don't have the capacity to either produce the coal or the oil or the gases for right now for our present requirement, certainly the extra requirement will have to be imported. What is the cost? Let us try to calculate the cost. The cost is exorbitantly high. It will not only push that cost, it will push the cost of the other fossil fuel cost also. And so this is the thing we will have to, at the end of the day, we will have to understand energy has a cost. Now how to address it, that has to be debated, discussed, and then again action is to be taken. That's what I have to emphasize.
So I'm going to be slightly academic or theoretical, and maybe Jean-Michel could jump in a little bit. India does not operate mostly on markets as of now. We have some markets, day ahead, term ahead. They're about 10% of the energy, roughly. 6%, yes. And then a lot of it is bilaterals or trades within the power exchange. The power exchange is around 13%, but it's not all markets. You're right, yes. Now, what that means is when I have a new fuel, any fuel, that's costly. Let's say you want firm power and we move to the world beyond VRE, variable RE. So you make it firm, which is a premium. That does not raise the prices in an Indian system as much as it would in Europe, because you're not shifting a major market clearing price for all the users. So is that a good thing from the Indian perspective? Potentially. But at the same time then, how do we get enough signaling to grow enough clean, futuristic power, not just VRE? There is no shortage of people wanting to build solar in the country. Now the flip side is there too much of a good thing?
The US is showing that market-based utility decision to increase renewable can exist and can go very up. But there are market-based utility decisions, so you cannot generalize which state, what year, what kind of resource. You cannot generalize. Each one is taking decision. As soon as you want to generalize and you want to have targets implemented in a given year, you have to push things. And then you have to cross your fingers and to wish that regulators at the federal level, regulators at the state level are able to resist to too blind political pushes from politicians or from the population. But it's not easy to resist political pushes from the politicians and from the population. Not easy, difficult.
Anywhere in the world.
Anywhere, including Norway, including Sweden, including Finland, anywhere.
Energy has a cost, we have to accept.
Yeah. So before we open to the audience, I'm going to do something a little different, which is, oh, sorry.
No, I think if the time is not.
No. In fact, I'm going to open it up where anyone here would like to ask a question, either rhetorical or to each other, or things that are on your mind. That's a new way to get something that maybe, so please, or any other remarks.
I had a general remark basically about my fundamental question is how much renewable can be absorbed by the economy? That's the critical question.
Economy or grid?
You know, economy will drive the grid. It is not the grid which will drive the economy will drive the grid, because if there is going to be demand in the economy, The grid has to adapt to meet that demand. So that is number one. Number two, it is not that if we set up a solar power plant is going to contribute to my grid. That time, the solar is available from say 7 or 6 to say 4, 5 or 6 p.m. But the load is 24/7. So unless until you add battery to that, it's not going to be of any use. If you add the battery to that, then it is no longer energy. It becomes two-part. Exactly. Now it becomes two-part, then the dilemma, we have got a system of merit order dispatch, which is based on two-part tariff, whereby the cheapest variable is injected in order of merit and the renewable gets the priority. So the regulatory challenge which emerges, if it is hybrid, then how it's going to be put into the merit order? Whether it will have the must-run status or it will be like that. So these new questions will keep on evolving, and as we move forward, we have to, either through policy measures or through any other things, we have to, address that. Second, I'm sorry, I'm taking a bit long. My second thing is, as Mr. Sen has said, energy has got cost. Nobody is disputing that energy has a cost. But the question is, how much cost the country or the individual should spend towards meeting his energy obligation. We have to take all the countries, be it developed or developing country. Take, for example, United States. United States per capita income is, say, roughly $60,000, and its average per capita energy consumption is about 13,000 units, give or take a couple of percent. So their average tariff, earlier it was less, but now it has jumped to more than 25 cents to 30 cents. So you compute that 30 cents multiplied by 33, so it becomes $4,000 is annual per capita energy consumption.
Electricity.
Electricity. Out of 60,000. So what percent it becomes? You measure that. Then you come to India. The India's per capita income is 2,500, and the per capita energy consumption is about 1,300 units, and average cost of supply is roughly 7. So say 10 cents, you can presume. So 10 cents multiplied by 1,300 becomes about $130 out of per capita income of 2,500. So you will find that in per capita terms, average Indian spends much more than the developed country. And if you add to that the cost of, greening it or transition, it is going to go up. So what I'm saying is the burden, financial burden on the developing economy is a thing to be noted. And somebody said you have to just push. I think push is not going to work. It is how much you can pull, which is going to work.
Nicely put. Yeah.
So I want to agree with what you said, that energy burden and the cost of electricity is increasing. And one of the questions, so as we transition to new infrastructure the utility has to build, that's the exact question that regulators are asking is, can the ratepayers afford the cost of this transition? And a related question as we talk about procurement is, should the utility be the one to bear that risk? Because the utility is not bearing any risk if they get cost recovery. It's borne by us. Ratepayers. And to what extent can some of that risk then be borne by the market? So if we want to have competitive transmission where the third party is bearing the risk of building a transmission line, or competitive generation where the third party is bearing the risk of the generation, is that an opportunity to mitigate some of those increased costs? Because now the utility is not collecting a capital, right? So they're not getting their rate of return, which the United States is now averaging 10% for distribution. It's higher for transmission. So those are costs that are not having to be incurred by the utility and then not passed through to the consumer. So that's sort of my question.
Utilities in India operate as nonprofits.
Well, even in the nonprofit space, the United States, the the nonprofits have also been pushing back against solar and
I didn't say not for profit, but non-profit, yes.
So I think the question is then who's the entity who's best suited to bear those risks?
Can I respond to this?
Of course,
This is
exactly
what we have been debating. Actually, the total cost has to come out of economy. Now, if you say, this is my feeling that my per capita income say $50,000. The country's tax to GDP is one element, because then the, United States had tax to GDP 30% and 60,000, so it gives the government about 18,000 per capita capacity to spend in all activities. So that is one resource, part of it can meet that. And the ratepayers, those who cannot afford to meet, have to be subsidized by, in one form or other, by the taxpayer. So this is, this is how it is going to work. It is not that the burden has to exclusively fall back upon one category of consumer, because one who causes must pay. The consumer have not chosen to go in for the net zero. It's the policy makers have chosen. So the policy, the governments have chosen. The government must be a part of the bill for those who can't afford. This is one point.
And if I can paraphrase from what you've said, I think we want to get policies that are not zero-sum game. So as we get people saying, oh, I've turned green, well, you've passed on costs to somebody else. So that is another risk that we have to be upfront cognizant.
But then you also enabled benefit that were not realized before.
Yeah.
I was willing to say that very unfortunately, even for rich people like us or less rich people like Indians, we have benefits into pushing green. And it's very sad to say that this benefit is less hot waves, less cold waves, less people dying from pollution, urban pollution. And we do not use to take this into account because we see them as general factors, not market realities. They are not market realities, but they are realities. So which way to make this taken into account, each country to answer, or each state in each country to answer.
I think you've now flagged for another seminar and another day the point about value judgments, because economics relies in theory either on pricing things correctly or discovering the prices through a mechanism. And that doesn't apply everywhere, whether it's on pollution, whether it's on choice, security, and so many other aspects. So this is, I think, why we are all here and why we will be busy for the next some years as this transition is ongoing. Before I ask Mr. Pujari.
I just want to respond to that. The cost is one part, and the other one is that apportioning. Now, what we have been debating is, how much you can pass to various categories. Now, there is a we are not very clear, not because the issues are not known to the policymakers and regulators, but your choices are so limited. Resources are limited that you are really slightly confused how to do what. In the sense that you want your industries to be competitive, so you can't increase the prices. You want to give, protect the poor, affordability, you are stuck there. So you have contradictory messages coming from the thing. So, and they don't get reconciled. If you have unlimited KT, probably it is possible to do it. With the limited KT, we are extremely difficult. And the good thing that we have done, that 300 or 400 rupees per ton coal cess was introduced. We call it green cess. We thought that the money that time the price difference between the thermal and then renewable was pretty high. So when the coal prices went up, it was basically some parity came. And then that kitty that was created was supposed to address largely or fund these sort of issues. But unfortunately, again, because of the shortage of resources, that kitty has gone somewhere else. It has gone to a GST compensation fund. It was supposed to fund the renewable and take care of all these issues. But in a government thing, everything gets smashed up. So that fund got diverted for compensating state for the GST. So these issues were thought about, but then in the way somehow we probably lost the way. And then at the moment, even a crossroad where you have to, so much of tangling is there, I think you need to untangle and find out what exactly you want to do.
Clarity on your objective functions really is, I think, probably the most important discourse, one of the important discourses that we need.
Actually, our ambitions are much more than what we can afford.
I think you've put it very well. And you always want ambitions to be far. So as they say, aim for the stars and you'll reach the moon. But at the same time, you don't want false ambitions which can turn distortionary. So that balancing act is exactly what we have to strive for. Just one thing. I do want to give the audience, you've been very patient, chance for very short, please, not statements, but questions if possible, unless we have a mistake you want to clarify. Just introduce yourself and just, if it's directed to anyone, please state their name. Just time for 2 questions. And then
Rahul, one thing I want to just emphasize, power sector even today is subsidizing everything. The passenger tariff is subsidized by power sector. Do you know that?
Specifically coal.
Yeah, coal used to be in 100 class. It has been shifted to 140 class by that
145.
time. Mr. I don't take the name. And it jumped 40%, the cost jumped, freight.
Yeah.
So you can say we are subsidizing everything.
Yeah.
So instead of power, which is the most, backbone of the economy, backbone everything,
Well,
it is subsidizing everybody.
It's like renewables. There is no explicit subsidy for most renewables except rooftop solar. But there's a fair amount of implicit subsidies, which is fine. I'm not saying these are wrong, but you need to be transparent because then you can see are there better instruments for achieving the outcomes instead. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. My question is in continuation to your question. I mean, you asked that where is the money? So let me put myself in the shoes of investor for a few minutes. And I want to invest in batteries.
Sorry?
Batteries.
Batteries.
Storage. So we talked about the variable nature of renewable generation and then option for curtailment of renewables also. So if I want to invest in storage, and I do have the advantage of doing a TOU study in UP, so my question is to RP Singh sir. Sir, this is today's data. In morning 4 hours, utilities has purchased electricity from market at 12 rupees. Right now at 6:30, the rate is 12. As a battery investor, if I ask you that, let me sell this stored electricity, what solves other problems also, at 10 rupees, is it a fair statement? Or can it be deregularized? I can be given the advantage of arbitrage so that I can survive as an investor. Because when we interact to investors, this is the only question why I get from them, that where is my advantage, where is the certainty, where is the regulation? So this is a usual question we get from investors.
You know, battery storage has got many applications. At what end actually you want to interface with the grid, that will ultimately determine whether it's at the generation end or it's at the distribution end or it is in the transmission side. So the economics of battery storage varies from, its application. But to begin with, the distribution companies, they have been, in fact, I initiated that thing and I have advised them to put up a storage system at the substation level so that we save the transmission charges. And those substations which have basically catering to the industrial load, there this power will be used as and when required to meet the peak, so that the justification is there for them, because it is you will be basically providing a service on availability basis and the DISCOM will be paying you for your services. The risk is not there. You have to basically quote for your price and they will have their own energy. Your system availability time has to be defined and your round trip efficiency has to be defined. So that will, the risk is on the basically DISCOM whether they need your services or not. But we anticipate, since the peak load is growing and during the peak hours there is going to be shortage, etc., etc. So most probably your services, the battery operator services will be required. But I don't see, because it is a service provider, you are not a risk taker. You are not buying energy and selling. The energy is being provided for storage during off-peak hours by the distribution company. So that risk is not passed on. You are only a service provider for the distribution end. But if you are working on the ancillary side for the transmission or virtual transmission or as a generator, then the economics is totally different. I hope I have been able to answer your concern.
Just another small questions. Like I have kept a question for 2 rupees for the utility also. It's like
2 rupee?
For the utility also. If the price is 12, it's just a number.
No, 12 rupees, these are notional. The SECI
Right,
bid,
right.
if you are
Exactly.
considering the SECI bidding, that is a notional thing. SECI was buying power from all across country and then sending on the transmission line, and transmission costs are haywire these days. Ours is neatly thought.
And socialized.
So this is neatly thought of at the load center of the industrial users, at the substation, no transmission cost, everything is under control. Power to be procured by the DISCOM. They have got surplus power purchase agreement for the remainder of the period.
Right, right.
Only the peak load period is
Yes,
the correct. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Are there any other burning questions? Because we have, like a good grid, been dynamic with supply and demand of time. But I think in a very fruitful manner, because we knew many things, but I think the debate has been sharpened thanks to our esteemed panelists and discussions. If I could now request our chair, Shri Pujari, if you, to give any closing remarks or thoughts or suggestions, or even a wish list, if you had a magic wand.
I think, I think our debate or discussion has been frank and pretty fair. And then what we ultimately reached is that your ambitious target is fine, but we need to work around how to basically finance, and then those are very conflicting demands on the limited resources that we have. We need to work it out. I mean, that's not much easier said than done. Given the position that we have taken, I think scaling down of target is just impossible. I mean, maybe it will be much more stiffer in coming days. So we need to work out, and yes, it is a challenging time, and every country, I think, is not that are not facing the, of course, different type of challenges everybody is facing, but then we also in our own way facing. But then basic is not the technical challenges or other challenges which are difficult. This is this economic political challenges. I think this is much harder to decide, and then we can only debate and discuss, but then ultimate decision is by somebody else. And then I hope those get aligned to our ambition, so that our target, which otherwise, unless those gets aligned to your targets, we may talk about the targets, but we keep falling short of targets. I mean, so that's, and then it's not a good thing. I mean, you say 2070 net zero, and then, or you say that 300 gigawatt or by so and so date, and then you achieve 70%, 60%, and one failure is okay, but repeated shortfall, I think it gives bad credibility on ourselves. So that means either you say that your planning is wrong, or you're not thinking through, or not thought through your targets. I mean, that's message. We don't want that message to come out. So what we should do is that whatever we do put a target, I think we should have thought about it, thought through it, and then make sure that we achieve that. That's the limited point.
Thank you. And just to add one line to that, everything we've discussed so far today seems to have been a supply side issue. Grow RE, scale your supply, manage it. We want frameworks that enable demand management as well. The first fuel, efficiency, but it's not enough just to save energy. You ideally want to save energy at the right time and the right place. So that's a smarter system. I guess that's why we're here. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, ISGF. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this discussion. And thank you to my distinguished panelists.
To our speakers for joining us for this session. We'll stay back, sir, for a group picture. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Now I request Mr. P.K. Pujari, chair of the session, for this session, to felicitate all our speakers with a token of thanks.
Memento. Memento, please.
Idhar. To our moderator, Mr. Rahul Tongia. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Enrique from IEA. Thank you so much for joining. Mr. R.P. Singh. Thank you, sir. Mr. Christopher. Thank you so much, sir, for joining. Mr. Jean-Michel from FSR. Thank you, sir, for joining. Mr. R.N. Sen. And now I request Mr. Reggie Pillai from ISGF to felicitate our chair, Mr. P.K. Pujari, for this session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining.